Most of us grow up believing that when a currency is weak, the country behind it must be failing. It sounds logical. Strong nations have strong money, weak nations have scraps of paper. That's the Western story. But what if the equation is reversed? What if weakness can be engineered and used as power? In the late 1970s, China was crawling out of the wreckage of Mao's Cultural Revolution. Its economy was sealed off, its cities gray, its industries frozen in time. Then Deng Xiaoping appeared, a small man with an enormous idea to open the country to the world. In 1978, he launched a series of reforms that invited foreign capital and promised something unheard of: profit. Factories began to rise along the coast. Container ports buzzed like hives. China's leaders had a single mission: to industrialize faster than anyone thought possible. But speed requires fuel, and fuel costs money. How could they sell to the world while starting from so far behind? By selling cheap, unbelievably cheap. Here the story turns from ideology to arithmetic. Imagine the yuan, left to float freely, should trade at 5 per US dollar. As exports grew, demand for Chinese currency would push its value higher, 4 yuan, maybe less, making Chinese goods more expensive abroad. That was the danger. So Beijing made a radical choice. It would hold the yuan down. The People's Bank of China became a quiet puppeteer. Every time dollars poured in from exports, the bank bought them and issued more yuan, keeping its own currency weak. On paper, the exchange rate hovered around 8 yuan to the dollar. In reality, it was an invisible subsidy to every Chinese factory. Goods leaving Shanghai or Shenzhen entered foreign markets at a permanent discount. By 2014, China's foreign exchange reserves had swollen to nearly $4 trillion. That mountain of dollars was proof that the system worked. The yuan stayed cheap, Chinese goods stayed dirt cheap, and Western consumers filled their homes with the rewards of other people's labor. Picture it: a pair of sneakers worth $50 sold for 10. At first, it looks like charity. In the end, it's conquest. Lower prices buy market share, and market share buys control. Nike could dominate the world the same way if it chose to undersell everyone until no rivals remained. China simply did it at national scale. Through the 1980s and 90s, Chinese factories multiplied like mushrooms after rain. Trade surpluses ballooned. American and European consumers reveled in the flood of low-cost goods. Walmart became a shrine to globalization, every aisle lined with the evidence of China's quiet revolution. Cheap televisions, cheap clothes, cheap everything. But cheap has a cost. While Western shoppers celebrated, their own factories began to die. Manufacturing jobs moved east, first slowly, then in waves. Small industrial towns in America's Midwest grew hollow. The lights stayed on, but the machines went silent. And still, politicians called this progress. They told voters that a strong dollar was proof of national vitality. They never saw the irony. Each strong dollar bought another shipment from Guangzhou, and each dollar sent overseas soon came back, not as goods, but as debt. Here's how the loop worked. Every dollar spent on Chinese exports ended up in China's central bank. Instead of sitting idle, those dollars were lent back to the United States through treasury bonds. Washington financed its deficits with the very money it had just spent abroad. The cycle was elegant, almost poetic. America consumed, China produced, and both pretended it was balance. By the early 2000s, the results were undeniable. China had transformed itself from a rural backwater into the workshop of the planet. Ports like Ningbo and Shenzhen became the busiest on Earth. Skylines erupted with cranes and concrete. Highways stitched the provinces together, feeding an industrial organism of impossible scale. To Western eyes, it looked like a miracle of globalization. To Beijing, it was proof of design. The weak currency was not a symptom, it was the engine. Every undervalued yuan bought time to build factories, railways, and an educated workforce. Hundreds of millions left poverty behind, and the country gained a kind of momentum that no tariff or speech could stop. Yet every strategy casts a shadow. In Washington, officials began accusing Beijing of currency manipulation. They weren't wrong, but they missed the point. Manipulation sounded like cheating. In truth, it was calculation. A cheap yuan filled American stores but emptied American factories. It lifted Chinese wages but suppressed American ones. It was a trade of illusions. The West kept its pride. China kept the profits. By the dawn of the new millennium, the pattern was set. China had turned monetary weakness into geopolitical strength. Its leaders didn't worship the prestige of a strong currency. They worshipped the leverage a weak one provided. And while Western commentators debated fairness, China quietly built the infrastructure of dominance, ports, roads, and supply chains that stretched across continents. The 20th century had belonged to the dollar. The 21st was beginning to whisper a new name. And though few in the West realized it, the world's factory was already becoming the world's creditor. By the mid-2000s, China's plan began to evolve. The ladder it had climbed, the weak yuan, was still in place, but now it was time to climb higher. Beijing started letting its currency appreciate, just a little, to silence critics and project confidence. The world called it reform. In truth, it was victory disguised as compromise. The cheap yuan had already done its work. Factories stood everywhere: steel mills, shipyards, electronics plants. Roads and ports formed a new nervous system of trade. China no longer needed a paper discount to rule global supply chains. It already owned them. A weak currency had been the spark. Industrial mastery was the fire that followed. In 2005, the yuan was unshackled from its fixed peg and allowed to rise gradually. By the early 2010s, Beijing loosened its grip further. Foreign economists applauded the change, believing the country was finally playing fair. But fairness had never been the point. The real game had shifted from currency to industry. The principle remained the same: sacrifice profit now, secure control later. State subsidies poured into steel, solar panels, and soon after electric vehicles. Factories could sell below cost for years, absorbing losses that would have bankrupted private rivals elsewhere. Markets flooded, competitors drowned, and once dominance was secured, prices stabilized. It was currency devaluation reborn as industrial policy. Western capitals reacted with outrage and tariffs. Politicians spoke of unfair trade and predatory pricing. But by then, the advantage was structural. China had become too integral to isolate, too vast to replace. Every smartphone, every turbine, every solar cell carried a fragment of its supply chain. Dependence had replaced dominance, quietly and completely. And while factories thrived, Beijing began to chase a different prize: monetary sovereignty. For decades, the US dollar had ruled world finance, forcing others to live within Washington's orbit. China wanted its own center of gravity, so it started encouraging trade directly in yuan. Oil contracts with the Gulf states, infrastructure loans across Asia and Africa, settlements under the Belt and Road Initiative. Each deal shifted a little more gravity eastward. Then came the digital yuan. Unlike cryptocurrencies born in basements, this one was built by the state itself. It wasn't about speculation, it was about control. A digital currency allowed Beijing to monitor flows of money in real time, bypassing the Western-dominated banking network. If successful, it could let China leapfrog the old system altogether. In 2016, the International Monetary Fund added the yuan to its elite basket of reserve currencies. Symbolically, it meant parity with the dollar, euro, pound, and yen. Psychologically, it marked the end of China's apprenticeship. The student of global trade had become a master of global finance. Still, the West clung to its own myths. Politicians boasted of strong dollars and strong euros, mistaking strength on the exchange board for strength in the real world. But China had already rewritten the rulebook. It proved that prestige can be traded for power, and that a nation's real wealth lies not in its currency's value, but in what that currency has built. A weak yuan had financed ports, railways, satellites, and entire cities. It had turned paper into stone. Of course, strategy breeds friction. Keeping industry subsidized fueled overcapacity and domestic debt. Foreign pressure mounted and trade wars flared. Yet even amid tariffs and sanctions, China's core advantage survived. Once a supply chain forms around you, it doesn't leave easily. Factories can move, ecosystems cannot. Think of the pattern. Rome once debased its silver coins to stretch its empire. Spain flooded Europe with American bullion to fund conquest. The United States printed dollars to sustain its reach. China devalued its yuan to build its own. Different tools, same logic. Money is never neutral. It is policy, weapon, and mirror all at once. By the 2020s, the echo of that long-ago devaluation still shaped the world. The UN was no longer pegged, but its philosophy endured. Accept short-term pain for long-term gain. Factories that once made toys now built satellites. Engineers who once sewed garments now design batteries. The ladder of cheap currency had been kicked away, but it had already done its job, lifting a nation from scarcity to supremacy. Meanwhile, in the West, the debate continued. Was China cheating or simply thinking in centuries while others thought in quarters? Each tariff and sanction looked like a reaction to yesterday's move, not tomorrow's plan. Beijing didn't need to shout, it only needed to wait. The paradox is easy to miss. In the Western imagination, a weak currency means failure, a symbol of lost confidence. But to China, weakness had been a weapon of patience. While others valued prestige, it built capacity. While others demanded recognition, it built resilience. And when the numbers finally rose, it no longer mattered. The foundation was already set. History loves to rhyme. Empires have always stretched their currencies to stretch their power. China simply perfected the technique for a new age. The empire it built was not one of colonies and cannons, but of containers and circuits. Its soldiers were workers, its conquest measured in contracts. And all of it began with the most misunderstood choice in modern economics: to make its money weak so that its future could be strong. So when you hear talk of strong currencies and market confidence, remember this story. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through exchange rates, interest spreads, and factory shifts. The scoreboard may say one thing, but the real game is played in the shadows of strategy. Because weakness, when chosen, is not weakness at all. It is intent. And intent, repeated long enough, becomes destiny.